So once again, greeting everybody. It is Monday, it's the Deer Park, it's the Buddha Center. Let's get started like we normally do, short period of bell meditation. Again, wherever you are behind your avatar, please get into a nice meditation posture. And as I ring the Ching bell, just focus on the sound of the bell. Get that deep listening going. Let's absorb some Dharma today. If you get distracted, I just want you to gently remind yourself and go back to focusing on the sound of the bell. There'll be a pause after the short meditation. I'll do the 3 recitations and then on with the talk. So I'll give you a moment, get into a nice meditation posture, and we'll begin at the sound of the bell. I go for refuge to the Buddha, the teacher. I go for refuge to the Dharma, the teaching. I go to refuge for the Sangha, the taught. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. I have taken refuge in the Buddha. I have taken refuge in the Dharma. I have taken refuge in the Sangha. 3 pure precepts. Cease to do harm. Do only good. Do good for others. Bodhisattva vow. However innumerable all beings are, I vow to lead them all. However inexhaustible my delusions are, I vow to extinguish them all. However immeasurable the Dharma teachings are, I vow to master them all. However endless the Buddhist way is, I vow to follow it completely. Swaha. The subject for today is aggression. And I actually had a different talk picked. This was going to be later in the year, but with the stuff going on, I thought now's a good time because it's so applicable, right? So we're going to talk about aggression as a causal factor. Excuse me. A fundamental ideal of Buddhist philosophy and practice is nonviolence. or ahimsa. You hear this talked about, just as equally as we talk about the alleviation of suffering, right? We talk about nonviolence. And violence, any physical action that results in the harm or the death of another being, or any thought of such, is antithetical to the development of compassion and loving kindness, and to the liberation from suffering in this life. These are things we're shooting for as Buddhists, right? That's why we're walking the path. Verse 300 of the Dhammapada reads, quote, "Those disciples of Gautama ever awaken happily, whose minds by day and night delight in the practice of nonviolence," unquote. The awakened one, the Buddha, he's pointing here first at the reality that violence and aggression, these are mind-mediated thoughts and actions. We don't do them unless we think about them. And though the verse doesn't specifically mention aggression, experience reveals that aggressive thought is a causal factor in the arising of violent action. We know that through experience, both our own and the experiences of others. So aggression leads to violence. Eliminate aggression in thought, and we can eliminate violence in action, at least to a pretty large degree. And again, we talk about rigorous self-honesty. We have to be societally honest too. Reality is that violence just abounds in this world. Acts like murder and rape and war and genocide, as well as a whole host of other thoughts and actions that can cause harm or death to living beings. They're happening all the time. And it seems that aggression and violence are as much a part of the human experience as is the suffering that the Buddha tells us about in the Four Noble Truths. An encompassing view of the world will reveal that not only does aggression and violence lead to suffering, seems logical, right? But suffering also leads to aggression and violence. And that's also very logical. That we can look around, we can see our own experience again in the experiences of others. Now, we've got a good, right now, in our face, contemporary example of this going on. The rioting and the protests that are occurring right now as a result of both the coronavirus pandemic and acts of police violence against African Americans and peaceful protesters, these are like our big contemporary examples of aggression, how aggression leads to violence and violence leads to aggression. Suffering that arises from economic and societal issues has citizens and authorities engaging in thoughts and actions resulting in harm to all involved, just making bad choices. And there is experiential truth then that aggression and violence are a factor of suffering. I think we can agree with that. But that doesn't mean it must always be that way. There is no permanence in human personality, so we can transform the unwholesome to wholesome compassion and loving kindness. We can do that. When aggression is accepted as the causal precursor to violence, then practice can begin to mitigate and, along that path, finally eliminate aggression in thought and action. Anchor a body-mind, yours or mine or anybody else's, in loving kindness, and aggression will find it really difficult to arise in that body-mind. Anchor a body-mind in compassion, and violence will find it difficult to arise in that body-mind. Transform thoughts, transforms actions. We each have a question we must ask as Buddhist practitioners. We've got to ask, and oh, by the way, we have to answer, of course, with rigorous self-honesty, is what acts of violence have I committed? Or what acts of violence am I considering doing? And these includes those little passing thoughts of, man, I'd just like to kill that guy for pulling out in front of me. Those count. But none or very few of you is likely, or excuse me, the answer for most of you would be none. I've never committed a violent act. I'm not even considering a violent act. That's most of us. None. That's the honest answer. Because most people have never taken a truly violent action on purpose. It is likely, though, that most people have engaged in aggression in one of its many forms, whether it be in thought or in action. To reach the ideal of nonviolence requires an acceptance of the realities of our aggressive habitual reactivities, unwholesome dispositions and habits that arise without mindfulness. Once accepted, there must be a commitment to weeding the body-mind of them, right? Getting them out. When aggression is accepted as a major causal precursor to violence, our practice, again, can begin to mitigate it and finally eliminate it. So we can eliminate aggression and allow violence to fall away. Man, I have to throw it in here right now. Is any of this easy? No, it's not. But it's so valuable, both to our transformation of ourselves and our transformation of society around us. So aggression. You know, there are two really typical, really common examples of aggression. Intentional rudeness and intentional disrespect. That is the two most common ways that aggression occurs in human interaction. And whether it is forcing their way to the front of the line at a grocery store, checkout line, or loudly making fun of a woman in a burqa, it is aggression. There is experiential proof that aggressive actions such as these will lead to violence. So in the first instance, the forcing their way to the front of the line at a grocery store, I was witness to this, and it ended up in a fist fight in the aisle. The other example, in the second example, it was two men, or it was a man on a bus, and he was harassing a lady in a burqa, and two men that were on the bus attempted to intervene, and they were stabbed. One died of his injuries. And these are physical reactions. But a Buddhist practitioner must be mindful that even the thought of taking such rude and disrespectful actions is aggressive behavior. Aggression leads to violence. The more that aggression is limited in thought and action, the more that violence is limited in action. There's another thing going on that is aggression. I know it's been going on for quite a while in the U.S., but now there seems to be much more of it, and that is the open carry of weapons in public. You know, having a long gun slung over your back, or openly carrying a pistol in a holster on your hip as you walk around doing your normal daily activities. These are acts of aggression. And even if the law allows it, it's still an act of aggression. And to further this idea, even carrying a concealed weapon is aggressive. In both cases, you might think, well, wait a minute. Well, nobody's committed a violent act. They're just carrying a weapon around with them. And you'd be correct. But remember, we aren't just talking about acts of aggression and violence. In Buddhist philosophy and practice, there is acceptance of the role that the mind has in how we interact with the world around us. How we think is of equal importance to the actions we take. Carrying a weapon, in view or concealed, is done with the anticipation of aggression or violence. And so, creates in the mind, through the consciousness, A continuous possibility of the same. So a continuous possibility of aggression and violence is created in the mind because you've got a weapon on your hip or on your back or in your pocket. And it might seem an odd realization, but the expectation of violence is aggression. The individual practice of eliminating aggression begins with the mind. It begins with, how do I choose to think? And letting go of the fear of what might happen is a step on that path. Because fear, major causal factor of aggression. When we get afraid and that fight or flight thing takes over, we're ready, right? The practitioner then must ask themselves what they have to fear. And then, with rigorous self-honesty, answer that question. Determine if the fear being experienced is founded in reality or in delusion. We can, there's a really clear example of this that we can use, considering what's going on right now. One thing the African American community faces from others is fear. And you can see that when you see a young African American man in his 20s walking down the sidewalk, and again, you've probably seen this, I have too, and say a 50-year-old white lady is walking toward him on the sidewalk and she suddenly realizes it and crosses over to the other side of the street to walk on past. That's fear. That's fear that's not founded in reality. It's founded in delusion. And we can see these examples of how fear leads to aggression through our own lives and through the experiences of others. Chances are good that some of you are thinking right now, but wait a minute, what about defending myself or defending others? And that's a legitimate question. That's another question we need to ask. How can I defend without aggression, without violence? Well, the first question we have to ask is, just what the heck am I defending anyway? Right? Because if I'm defending the ego, well, heck, that's just a waste of energy. And if I'm defending from a physical attack, well, that's a whole nother matter entirely. The ideal of physical defense without aggression is a reality. You can defend without being aggressive. And it's all about the intent. We go back to that eightfold path, right? That appropriate intent. Intent is the key in this situation, in these types of situations. You can look to the martial arts practice of Aikido, and it offers a really good path to this. The founder of Aikido, Morihei Ueshiba, he said this, quote, and this is, you will find this like posted in Aikido dojos. It says, to injure an opponent is to injure yourself. To control aggression without inflicting injury is the art of peace, unquote. The foundation of the practice of Aikido is do the least harm to an attacker by redirecting the energy of violence. This not only works outside of you, externally, this very same thing can work internally. Let's hear it again. To injure an opponent is to injure yourself. To control aggression without inflicting injury is the art of peace. Now, why do I say this has anything to do with internal? It's because of the way we can treat ourselves, how we can be aggressive to ourselves, how we can see ourselves as an opponent, and we can injure ourselves. And so we want to control those aggressive thoughts without inflicting any injury within us. We don't want to insult ourselves or be mean to ourselves to do it or anything like that. We just want to find that aggression falling away so we can find that art of peace. I said earlier, most people have never purposely taken a truly violent action or been the victim of violence that led to physical injury. Most people have experienced some form of verbal or non-damaging physical aggression. Like somebody getting right up in your space kind of idea. So the ideal set forward by Master Ushiba can be applied to that reality. We just respond in such situations with calm and equanimity. Walk away if possible. Do not return verbal injury with verbal injury. Do not return rudeness and disrespect with the same. Instead, respond more appropriately with actions of loving kindness and the voice of compassion. And I have to throw it in here again. Is this easy? No. But you'll find great value in it once you can, I won't say master the practice, but get lots of experience with it. There's an essay by Bhikkhu Bodhi called Laying Down the Rod. And this is about violence and aggressiveness. And he writes this, quote, "Though violence, either overt or subtle, may hold sway over the world in which we are afloat, the Buddha's path to freedom requires of us that we make a total break with prevailing norms. Thus, one of the essential steps in our endeavor to reach the abode of safety is to lay down the rod, to put away violence, aggression, and harmfulness toward all living beings. In the Buddhist teaching, the laying down of the rod is not merely an ethical principle, a prescription for right action. It is a comprehensive strategy of self-training that spans all stages of the Buddhist path, enabling us to subdue our inclinations toward ill will, animosity, and cruelty," unquote. Those last three things that Bhikkhu Bodhi is talking about there are inclinations toward ill will, animosity, and cruelty. It's from those things that aggression arises. It's from those type of habits or dispositions that aggression will most surely arise. So these days it might seem that aggressiveness and violence is just everywhere, and that belief is strengthened by the language being used. In politics, for example, there used to be opponents. Now there are enemies. Contest became war. Political rhetoric uses combative words like campaign to describe the activities of elected officials. In sports, it used to be the Rams play the Falcons. Now the Rams battle the Falcons. In the social arena, it was us and them. Now it's us versus them. And these examples may seem trivial, but it's the trivial that can really come back and bite us in the butt, because these are subtle examples of aggressive habitual reactivities. We must be mindful of the language we use as an element of a path to non-aggression and then ultimately to non-violence. As a part of your moment-to-moment practice, make the right effort to excise aggressive, violent words from your vocabulary. It'll help. There are some words that commonly indicate aggression and violence. Words like hate, versus, battle, in your face, and militant. These are examples. And there is a way of thinking that aggression equals self-confidence, or determination, or dynamism, or commitment. This is what some people see aggression as being synonymous with almost. And while aggression can certainly be a factor in those types of thoughts and actions, it doesn't have to be. You can be all of those things without any thought of aggression or violence. You can be quietly, calmly, and respectfully self-confident, determined, dynamic, and committed. But you don't have to have the aggression to do it. There is a way of thinking that violence equals intensity or strength or passion and vigor. Well, you can quietly, calmly, and respectively be intense and be strong and be passionate and be vigorous. It is both right intent and action to be self-confident, determined, dynamic, committed, intense, strong, passionate, and vigorous without any thought of aggression or without any acts of violence. The Buddha set an example in his encounter with Angulimala. He set the example that one can quietly, calmly, and respectfully engage with aggression and violence. Angulimala, whose name, by the way, meant necklace of fingers, and that should tell you quite a bit right there, was just a violent murderer and what today we might term a terrorist. The Buddha purposefully sought him out, and when he was threatened by Angulimala, he didn't react with aggression. He responded with calm and even respect. The Buddha was confident, determined, and committed in his message of nonviolence, of ahimsa. And through that, he transformed Angulimala back into the man that was an example of his original name, ahimsa, or nonviolence. Each of us have Buddha element, and one way to begin to realize it is to be mindful of our own aggressive tendencies that might lead us to violent actions. We must be mindful that aggressive thoughts are just as dangerous as any violent action we might make. Let our Buddha element guide us away from unwholesome habitual reactivities to compassion and to loving kindness. Let these be our go-to thoughts and actions. Let these be our default setting. And in this way, we transform ourselves into better human beings, and we become the catalyst for others to take that same path. So during this talk, I brought up a little about the pandemic and the protests going on. I just want to finish out again to kind of connect this back to today a little more. We have to ask, are protests aggressive, just in their very nature? Well, like all things, the answer is dependent on the intent and the action. Non-aggressive is a silent sit-in protest in front of a governmental office. Or it's people standing, in the street where they've got their license to be, and they're singing or chanting or whatever, and there's no violence, there's no aggressiveness. People that are openly carrying guns and acting menacingly in front of that same office or standing in front of a group of people, this is aggressive. And we talked about why. Martin Luther King and Gandhi, they were all about non-aggression when it comes to protesting. They are our proof that aggression and violence is not synonymous with protesting. The great majority of protests against the killing of African Americans and of police brutality and race issues just in general have been peaceful. Or they were meant to be peaceful. They had no aggressive intent, only the intent to lawfully, key word there, lawfully gather and protest. But then other external forces were introduced, or external causal forces, if you will. Outside agitators and opportunists started rioting and looting. Now, did other people join in? Yes. That's the nature of the human being, right? But this amped up the aggressiveness of law enforcement, whose tendency toward violence rather than policing was already an issue. So even when law enforcement was seeing peaceful, or there was a peaceful protest and law enforcement were there, they weren't seeing peaceful. They were seeing aggressive. They were deluded. So law enforcement stopped determining which were peaceful protests and which weren't, and instead they defaulted to all protesters are dangerous and our aggression will be the best tactic against it. Law enforcement attacks, protesters react. Or protesters attack and law enforcement reacts, because it has happened that way too. A causal cycle of violence and aggression will gain strength until some other means of engaging the issue is found. Maybe we can help find it. But at least our actions and our thoughts won't add to the aggression, won't add to the violence, won't add to the suffering. Let's at least shoot for that.